Deep in the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky, hidden away in a world where time crawls and the outside world feels like a distant memory, there lies a story so bizarre, so haunting, that it defies everything we know about genetics, survival, and human nature. A story of a family that for over a century lived by laws carved into their very DNA. Their story isn't folklore or legend. It's the chilling reality of the most inbred family in Kentucky's history, a bloodline forged by 4 generations of cousin marriages. But what happens when a family tree stops growing outward and starts strangling itself? How does it survive, and at what cost? In 2019, a documentary filmmaker ventured deep into their isolated world, uncovering a tale of genetic isolation, survival, and a devastatingly dark legacy that most people have never heard of. This is the story of the Calloway family, a bloodline so inbred, so genetically isolated, that it challenges the very limits of human survival. But what happens when isolation reaches its breaking point? Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. That way, you'll never miss stories like this one. Let's get started. The mountains of eastern Kentucky stand as silent guardians, hiding a story few know. Deep within the hollows of Troublesome Creek, the Calloway family has lived in isolation for generations, forgotten by time. The gravel road leading to their home is hidden from sight. It's a place few dare to visit, a world where time doesn't follow the same rules as the rest of Kentucky. It's here that the Calloways survive. Jeremiah Calloway, the patriarch, first set foot in these mountains in the 1890s. His intent was clear: to establish a bloodline untouched by the world outside, one that would remain confined within the hollows forever. The coal boom raged around him, but Jeremiah wanted nothing of it. He chose seclusion over opportunity. His cabin, built from the land's raw materials, would become the starting point for a bloodline cut off from society. Unlike other pioneers who mingled with neighboring families, Jeremiah severed all ties. His children would marry within the family, ensuring that no outsider would ever alter the path he had carved out for his descendants. The Calloways didn't just survive, they isolated themselves further. By the time Jeremiah's sons grew up, the practice of marrying within the family was already in place. They married cousins to keep their bloodline intact. This decision wasn't a random act. It was deliberate, born out of necessity. The family's survival depended on its isolation. The mountains offered little, but it was all they needed to maintain their self-sustaining world. In the early generations, the consequences of their choices were not immediately clear. The family continued its way of life, marrying within the clan. The men worked together to grow food, build homes, and care for one another. However, as the second generation was born, subtle signs of genetic damage began to appear. Physical abnormalities, intellectual delays, and behavioral issues surfaced in the children of the first cousins. They were small, almost imperceptible at first. Despite these signs, the Calloways refused to break their pattern. They continued to marry within the family, clinging to their self-imposed isolation. The damage became more pronounced as the next generations followed the same path. By the third generation, the effects were undeniable. Men in the family began to suffer from deformities, mental challenges, and physical disabilities. Yet the patriarchs of the family remained firm in their decision to marry cousins. The isolation continued to protect the family from the outside world. Few outsiders knew of their existence. Those who did avoided speaking of them, keeping the Calloways hidden from view, like a dark secret buried in the mountains. The family's struggle became more visible. The men who were able to communicate with the outside world became the caretakers for those who couldn't. A new system of survival took shape, based on the genetic burden of their choices. Despite the hardships, the Calloways persevered. Their genetic decline, while obvious to outsiders, wasn't enough to stop them from continuing the practice. The men who could walk, talk, and think kept the family alive, carrying on the legacy. With each passing generation, the genetic issues grew more severe. The children of the fourth generation were genetically closer to each other than identical twins. Their bloodline had become dangerously concentrated, making survival less likely. The Calloway clan had become a living testament to the dangers of genetic isolation. No one from outside could understand the depth of the damage. The mountains offered protection, but the family's very existence was at risk. As the generations passed, the men in the Calloway family began to show signs of aging prematurely. Many died young, suffering from congenital conditions that were both visible and invisible. Their survival was becoming a tragedy. The Calloways' world, though hidden, was not impervious. Despite their isolation, local authorities knew of them but never intervened. The mountain community saw them as a mystery, too strange to confront, so they were left alone. The family remained hidden from public view. The Calloways had become a part of local lore, rumors whispered in taverns and church corners. The details of their lives remained unclear, their suffering unseen, their existence ignored. The Calloways, in their isolation, had created a world all their own. They had become a closed system, existing beyond the reach of modern society. But as time passed, it became harder to ignore the consequences of their actions. Despite all that had happened, the Calloways continued to survive. They had managed to keep their bloodline going even as it grew weaker with each generation. But how long could this isolation last? Would the world ever learn the truth? The mountains had protected the Calloways, but in the end, the world would eventually find out. The family that had survived through their own dark genetics would soon become the subject of national curiosity and perhaps scrutiny. Jeremiah Calloway arrived in Kentucky in the early 1890s, a man seeking more than land. His goal was simple but bold: create a bloodline isolated from the world, hidden in the mountains where no one could interfere. At a time when the world was rapidly changing, Jeremiah found solace in the quiet, harsh mountains. Far from the coal mines and bustling towns, he built a cabin and laid the first stone of his legacy. The land was unforgiving, but Jeremiah thrived. He saw no need for community. His goal was to ensure his bloodline remained pure, free from outside influence. His family would become their own world. Jeremiah's isolation wasn't by chance. It was a calculated decision. The more he cut ties with the world, the more his family became self-reliant. This decision would shape the future of the Calloway men for generations. With the mountains providing all they needed, Jeremiah's sons were raised without knowledge of the world outside. They were taught to work the land, to survive on what they could grow and hunt, living independently. As the years passed, Jeremiah's sons grew into men, and his plan to keep the family isolated intensified. They married within the family, sealing the bloodline and ensuring the Calloway name would remain untouched by outsiders. The first cousin marriages among the sons began in the 1910s. The patriarch had set the example, and his sons followed suit. Marrying within the family was now a tradition, one that would define the future of the Calloway men. The decision to marry within the family wasn't driven by love or desire, but by necessity. The Calloways were a family surrounded by wilderness. The outside world was too distant for new bloodlines to enter their world. When the first children were born from cousin marriages, few took notice of the subtle differences. The men of the family, focused on survival, never questioned the choices that had been made for them by their patriarch. As time passed, however, the consequences of this closed bloodline became undeniable. The first generation of cousin marriages saw children born with developmental delays and physical deformities. But no one dared question the system. Jeremiah's sons and grandsons continued marrying their cousins. What started as a simple decision soon became a tradition that was impossible to break. The family's fate was sealed in the very genetics that connected them. Though the visible effects were troubling, the Calloways carried on. The patriarchs refused to acknowledge the damage. Survival was all that mattered. They lived as though the world outside didn't exist, trapped in a cycle of isolation. By the 1920s, the physical abnormalities were impossible to ignore. The men in the family were born with club feet, shortened limbs, and faces that seemed to reflect their genetic history more than their individuality. Yet the pattern continued. The Callaways had built their world on survival, and they continued to thrive despite the mounting genetic cost. The family didn't understand the full extent of the damage, but their lifestyle had already been defined for generations. In this closed world, there was no one to tell them otherwise. The men of the Callaway family had no knowledge of the outside world's advancements in medicine. Their way of life, their survival, was all that mattered. As the generations continued, so did the pattern. By the third generation of cousin marriages, the Callaways were more genetically isolated than ever. The deformities, developmental delays, and intellectual issues grew more pronounced with each passing year. Despite these issues, the family's way of life never wavered. Their isolation protected them from the scrutiny of the outside world. They remained in the shadows, their family continuing its closed, isolated existence without any outside interference. The Callaways' way of life had become an unbreakable cycle. The men in the family continued to marry within the clan, perpetuating the genetic isolation that had started with Jeremiah. They lived in a world governed by their own rules. The harsh realities of their choices were hidden from view. The family, isolated in their mountain fortress, had become a living testament to the dangers of genetic isolation. But to them, it was simply life as they knew it. Jeremiah's decision had changed the course of his family's history. What had begun as a simple desire for self-reliance had become a deeply ingrained tradition. The men of the Callaway family were bound by blood, by choice, and by isolation. By the time the second generation of Callaways had reached adulthood, the family was deeply entrenched in its traditions. The mountain life had become their identity, and their isolated bloodline seemed impervious to outside forces. The men of the Callaway family, now accustomed to their secluded life, continued to marry within their clan. The genetic consequences, however, were beginning to show. The first real signs of genetic damage were subtle at first. By the 1920s, the effects of inbreeding became more visible. Children born from cousin marriages began to show developmental delays and intellectual disabilities. Physical deformities were also becoming more pronounced, but the family did not yet understand the cause. At first, the family attributed these issues to the harsh mountain conditions. They blamed poor nutrition, lack of formal education, or the difficult way of life. But the damage was more deeply rooted than they could see. The Callaways, bound by their patriarch's vision, continued to marry their cousins. The idea of breaking tradition was unthinkable. They couldn't fathom the consequences of their actions, and the outside world was too far away to intervene. As the second generation of cousin marriages grew, the damage became harder to ignore. Children were born with increasingly severe disabilities. Some couldn't walk or speak properly. Others had facial deformities that were unmistakable to outsiders. Despite the mounting evidence, the Callaways did not change their ways. The men of the family continued to marry cousins, believing their way of life was sustainable. The idea of seeking help or changing their practices was never considered. The family's isolation kept them safe from scrutiny. The closest neighbors were miles away, and no authorities checked in on them. The Callaways were free to live as they pleased, without any outside interference, despite the growing biological consequences. As the third generation came of age, the genetic issues grew more severe. The children of the second generation were now facing disabilities so severe they could not function in society. Yet, the family kept its course. The Callaway men were determined to continue the legacy they had inherited. They lived by their own rules, and to them, survival in the mountains was more important than anything else. Nothing else could alter their chosen path. Despite the growing crisis, the family's patriarchs continued to arrange cousin marriages. They refused to acknowledge the long-term effects of their decisions. The family had become a closed system, and its survival relied on its own inner logic. The Callaways had no contact with medical professionals who could diagnose or understand their genetic issues. The family's medical care came from local healers who had no knowledge of genetics or the consequences of inbreeding. The men who were able to work maintained the family's self-sufficiency. They built homes, grew crops, and kept to themselves, never reaching out for help. The mountain life was their world, and it was all they knew. By now, the Callaways had created a distinct identity, shaped by isolation and genetic deterioration. The younger generations had learned the ways of their fathers and grandfathers, perpetuating the cycle of cousin marriages with no outside interference. The pattern seemed unbreakable. The family had survived by their own rules for decades. They believed the world outside their mountains was irrelevant, but the genetic toll was growing, and the family could no longer ignore the cost. The outside world had changed dramatically, but the Callaways remained frozen in time. As medical science advanced, the family continued on a path that seemed inevitable. They lived in a bubble, unaware of the growing storm outside. The tipping point was near, but the Callaways did not know it. The men continued marrying cousins, passing on the damage with each generation. Their world seemed solid, but in reality, it was crumbling from within. By the time the third generation reached adulthood, the Callaways were no longer just an isolated family. They were living proof of the dangers of genetic isolation. The world would soon discover the consequences of their survival strategy. As the third generation of Callaways grew into adulthood, the effects of their closed bloodline became undeniable. The visible signs of genetic damage were now apparent in every aspect of their lives, but no one outside the family knew. The men of the family continued their tradition of marrying cousins, unaware of how much damage their bloodline had endured. What had once seemed like a self-sustaining, isolated existence was now spiraling into genetic catastrophe. The children born to the third generation showed marked differences from their cousins. Some were born with severe physical disabilities, unable to walk or even feed themselves. Others suffered from intellectual disabilities so severe that they could not communicate. The Callaways lived in a state of denial. They had no contact with medical professionals and did not understand the concept of genetics. They believed the family's troubles were just bad luck or the result of harsh mountain life. The men who were still able to work took care of the family's basic needs. The community around Troublesome Creek had learned to stay away. The Callaways were an anomaly, their survival seen as something not to be disturbed. As time passed, more and more of the family members were unable to care for themselves. The once proud men of the Callaway clan were now plagued by disabilities that made them entirely dependent on one another. They had become caretakers for one another. Despite the growing problems, the family continued to marry within their own. Their patriarchs, who had founded this self-sustaining world, saw no reason to change their ways. The family's survival was based on their isolation. Nothing could alter their course. The external world had long since forgotten about the Callaways. Their homestead was too far out of the way for anyone to visit, and the genetic issues within the family went unnoticed by the local authorities, who were aware but uninterested. The most tragic part of this isolation was that the family had no way to break the cycle. They had no outside influence, no understanding of what they were doing. The men carried on as their fathers had, without question. By the fourth generation, the damage was beyond repair. The genetic toll had become so severe that the family could no longer function as it once had. But despite this, the family continued to live in their mountain fortress, unchanged. There were no hospitals to go to, no doctors to seek advice. The Callaways were left to their own devices, and as the genetic damage worsened, the men were left with no choice but to care for one another. At this point, the family had become a biological disaster, yet they persevered. They had lived so long in isolation that they had developed their own ways of survival, even in the face of insurmountable odds. Some of the men, those who could still walk and speak, became the de facto leaders of the family. They were the ones who made decisions, ensured food was grown, and took care of those who could not care for themselves. But even they were beginning to suffer. The mental and physical toll on the Callaways was visible in the way they moved and spoke. Their bodies were aging prematurely, yet they were still expected to continue the family's way of life. The outside world still had no idea of the horror unfolding in the hollows of eastern Kentucky. The Callaways were a forgotten family, hidden in plain sight. Their suffering remained unseen by the larger society. Despite the invisible and visible damage, the Callaways carried on. They were bound by a tradition that no one outside the family could understand. Their lives, though marked by hardship, were a testament to the resilience of those left forgotten. For those living nearby, the Callaways were a family that didn't fit. They were known for their strange behavior, their inability to communicate in a typical way. The men, despite their disabilities, lived on as if their way of life could last forever. The Callaways had built a world around their own genetic fate. And while their survival was remarkable, it came with a heavy price, one that no outsider could understand. Their continued existence was a form of living tragedy. The Callaways had endured a legacy of genetic isolation for over 3 generations, but they had never wavered in their commitment to survival. Despite their deteriorating health, they clung to their isolated way of life. In their minds, survival meant continuity. To the outside world, the family's existence was a strange anomaly, but to the Callaways, it was simply life. Their ancestors had survived in the mountains, and they would do the same. Each new generation carried the burden of their ancestors' choices. The men who could still function had become caretakers for the others, ensuring that the family's self-sustaining way of life continued, even as their health worsened. Despite the mounting challenges, the Callaways never considered abandoning their way of life. The idea of moving to the outside world, of integrating with society, was foreign to them. They were bound to the mountains, bound to each other. They had created a world in which they could survive, even if it meant sacrificing their own health. The family's survival depended on the men who could still think, speak, and care for those who could not. Their isolation had become a double-edged sword. While it protected them from outside interference, it also ensured that the family's struggles were hidden from the world. The Callaways were a family of survivalists, but the cost was becoming unbearable. As the generations passed, the men of the family had become more reliant on each other. The younger Callaways were forced to step up, taking on responsibilities that they might not have been ready for, but necessity drove them. Though the family's way of life had become increasingly difficult, they continued to maintain their home, grow their food, and care for their own. They had built a self-sufficient world that could not be easily destroyed. But even the strongest of the Callaways couldn't ignore the toll their decisions had taken. The physical and mental deterioration of the family was evident in the way the men moved, spoke, and interacted with one another. The damage was so profound that many of the family members couldn't recognize how much they had deteriorated. They had known no other way of life, and despite the overwhelming consequences, they believed survival was the only thing that mattered. Isolation had become the family's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It allowed them to live freely, without interference, but it also meant they were cut off from the resources and knowledge that could have helped them break the cycle. As the family's survival continued to hang by a thread, the men found solace in each other. They had no outside world to rely on, no government services, no doctors, and no experts to help them understand their plight. In this world, survival wasn't just about finding food or shelter. It was about adapting to the circumstances, no matter how dire they became. The Callaways had adapted, but at the cost of their health and well-being. The younger generation of Callaways had grown up knowing only this life. They had learned to accept their family's struggles as normal. To them, the world beyond the mountains was irrelevant. They were survivors, and that was enough. By the time the third generation of Callaways reached adulthood, Their world had become a prison of their own making. The isolation that had once been their refuge now trapped them in an unbreakable cycle. The men of the family, though once proud of their self-sufficiency, now faced the consequences of their decisions. Their physical and mental decline was evident in every aspect of their lives, yet they continued to endure. With each passing year, the genetic damage became more severe. The children born to the third generation were even more genetically similar to their siblings than the last, creating a level of homozygosity that no one outside the family could comprehend. They lived in a world where their survival depended entirely on their ability to care for each other. The family had no outside help, no access to medical resources, and no way to break free from the damage that had been done. The men of the Calloway family had created a system of survival, but it came with a devastating cost. They had no choice but to continue the pattern, marrying cousins and producing children who inherited the genetic flaws of their forefathers. Despite the increasing challenges, the family kept to their ways. The older men cared for the younger ones, those who had been affected by the genetic toll. The family's survival had become a delicate balance, teetering on the edge of disaster. The Calloways no longer had the strength or health to live as they once had. Some of the men could barely walk, others could not communicate at all. But their survival instincts remained, and they relied on each other to get by. The isolation that had once protected them now served as a prison. They were trapped in a cycle of inbreeding that only perpetuated their problems. There was no escape, no way to break free from the path their ancestors had set. Despite the obvious physical and mental challenges, the Calloways did not see their situation as tragic. They had grown up in this environment, and to them, it was normal. They knew nothing else and understood nothing else. Their world had shrunk to a small, self-contained unit. They cared for the land, tended to their livestock, and took care of one another. Yet the genetic flaws were becoming impossible to ignore, even for them. Their bodies were deteriorating. The family had built a small society in the mountains, where each member played a role. The men who could still speak acted as leaders, directing the work and ensuring the family's continued survival, despite the toll it had taken. Every day was a struggle, but they had learned to endure. The younger generation of Calloways had grown up in this world, learning from the older men how to survive in a place where the rules were determined by genetics. The family's isolation had kept them safe from the eyes of the world, but it had also condemned them to a life of suffering. They were living in a biological prison, one that they couldn't escape. As the years wore on, the Calloways became more dependent on each other. The older generation could no longer do much, and the younger generation took on more responsibilities. The family had become a network of caretakers, bound by their shared fate. Despite their hardships, the Calloways had found a way to survive. They had become experts in survival, not just in the physical sense, but in the emotional and mental sense as well. They relied on each other, but the cost was evident. The family's isolation had become both a strength and a curse. It protected them from the world, but it also sealed their fate. They were trapped in their own history, unable to escape the consequences of their actions. The Calloways were living in a world of their own, one that no outsider could understand. They had created a life for themselves, but it was a life marked by genetic failure, mental decline, and physical deformities. Yet, they survived. The Calloways had built their fortress in the mountains, a place so remote that few had ever seen it. The land they lived on was both their salvation and their curse, providing everything they needed to survive. Hidden deep in the hollows, their homestead was a labyrinth of cabins and makeshift shelters. There were no roads leading to it, no signs of civilization. It was a world untouched by modernity, a world they had created for themselves. Over time, the Calloways had become a legend in the region, known for their strange customs and secluded life. The locals spoke of them in hushed tones, but few dared to venture near their home. Their isolation had kept them safe, but it had also isolated them from help. They had no access to the outside world, no social services, no doctors, and no way to break the cycle of inbreeding that had defined their family. Despite the growing signs of genetic damage, the family remained cut off from any form of assistance. The men of the family had created a life for themselves, but it was a life that was quickly unraveling. The Callaways were stubborn, their pride preventing them from seeking help. They believed their way of life was their own, a choice they had made long ago, and they would see it through no matter the cost. The mountain fortress had been built to protect them, but it had also become a prison. The men who could still think, speak, and move were responsible for the care of those who could not. The family's survival depended on this unspoken agreement. The outside world had long since forgotten the Callaways. They were a part of the past, a family lost to time. The mountain had shielded them from the progress that had swept the rest of the world, but the cost of survival was beginning to show. The Callaways were physically deteriorating, and the younger generation was beginning to show signs of the same genetic issues that plagued the older members of the family. They had no escape. The family's way of life had been built on isolation and survival. But as the damage continued to mount, it was clear that their way of life was unsustainable. They had no resources to break the cycle they had created. The mountain fortress, once a symbol of self-reliance, had become a symbol of their downfall. The Callaways had trapped themselves in a world where the only way to survive was to continue the very practices that were killing them. For the younger men in the family, this world was all they knew. They had no understanding of the outside world, no knowledge of the progress that had been made in medicine or genetics. They lived in ignorance, unaware of the severity of their plight. The Callaways had no contact with the outside world. Their isolation kept them safe from the prying eyes of authorities, but it also ensured that their suffering went unnoticed. They were a forgotten family, trapped in time. As the generations passed, the men of the Callaway family continued to marry within their own bloodline, perpetuating the cycle of genetic deterioration. They had no way to break the pattern, no way to escape their fate. Yet, despite everything, the Callaways survived. They had lived in isolation for so long that their survival instincts had become second nature. They were a family forged by the mountains, and they were determined to remain there. But even the most stubborn of men could not escape the truth. Their world was collapsing. The mountain fortress had protected them for generations, but it was no longer enough. The family was running out of time. As the family's health continued to decline, the once proud men of the Callaway clan were becoming shadows of their former selves. They had survived for so long, but the cost of their survival was finally catching up with them. The mountain fortress had provided them with everything they needed to survive, but it had also trapped them in a never-ending cycle of genetic isolation. There was no escape, no way out of the life they had chosen. For decades, the Callaways lived in complete isolation, unnoticed by the outside world. But in 2019, a documentary filmmaker, Marcus Webb, stumbled upon their hidden world, exposing a family that had been forgotten by time. Webb had been traveling the backroads of eastern Kentucky, searching for stories about the region's poverty. When he took a wrong turn, he found himself at the edge of Troublesome Creek, unaware of the discovery he was about to make. What he found at the end of that unmarked gravel road shocked him to his core. The Callaway family, who had lived in isolation for over a century, was unlike anything Webb had ever encountered. They were a living tragedy. The men of the family, though severely affected by years of inbreeding, had somehow managed to survive. They were living proof of the devastating effects of genetic isolation, their lives a testament to the consequences of choices made generations ago. Webb's camera captured images of the family that would haunt him for years. The patriarch of the family, Thomas Callaway, could barely speak, his words unintelligible. His brother, Jimmy, sat rocking in a chair, staring into space. The living conditions were appalling. The Callaways lived without running water, electricity, or plumbing. They drew water from a contaminated creek and lived by candlelight and wood fires. It was a medieval existence in the 21st century. But it wasn't just the living conditions that shocked Webb. It was the genetic disaster unfolding before him. The men of the Calloway family, though still alive, were living with disabilities so severe that they could no longer communicate or care for themselves. Despite the growing evidence of genetic decline, the family had never sought medical help. They had no understanding of genetics, and no one had ever intervened in their lives. They had been left to their own devices, hidden away from society. Webb's documentary captured the heartbreaking reality of a family caught in a cycle of genetic destruction. The Calloways had been abandoned by both the outside world and the government, left to suffer in silence for generations. As the documentary aired on national television, the Calloway family's story became a sensation. The world was shocked by what they saw. How could such a tragedy have occurred in the heart of America, unnoticed for so long? The media frenzy that followed exposed the Calloways to the scrutiny they had long been hidden from. They became the subject of scientific curiosity, with geneticists and doctors flocking to their remote mountain home to study their condition. For the Calloways, it was a moment of reckoning. The family that had once lived in complete isolation now found themselves thrust into the spotlight. Their once hidden world was now a source of national debate, but the exposure came at a cost. The Calloways, who had lived by their own rules for so long, were now subject to the judgment of the outside world. Their privacy had been stripped away, and their tragic story was now a public spectacle. The Calloways had become symbols of a greater moral dilemma. How far should society go to intervene in the lives of isolated families like theirs? Could intervention have prevented the genetic catastrophe that had claimed their family for generations? In the wake of the documentary's success, questions arose about the ethics of genetic intervention and the role of the state in protecting vulnerable families. Should the Calloways have been allowed to continue their isolated existence, or was intervention necessary? For the Calloways, it was too late for intervention. The damage had been done. The family's fate was sealed by the decisions of their ancestors, and they would live out their days in the shadow of their own genetic history. Despite everything, the Calloways had survived. They had lived for over a century in isolation, enduring unimaginable hardship, and now their story would become a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of unchecked isolation and genetic deterioration. As the cameras rolled and the world watched, the Calloway family's silent suffering was finally revealed. But for them, nothing had changed. They were still trapped in the mountains, still living by the same rules that had defined their existence for generations.